I'd like to welcome everyone to this talk from Russ Ganim, who is a dean of international programs. Russ?
My official title is Associate Dean and Associate Provost and Dean of International Programs. Sorry.
Thank you. That's a better introduction than I will give. But I'm really excited about this very timely talk on international education in this era of COVID, and hopefully we can make it into a dialogue as well, and about, the state of international students. There's been a lot of ups and downs in the past 9 months or so, and what the visa requirements and OPT and all of those things. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, Russ.
Well, thank you, Claire, and thank you, Lauren and Nicole, and thank you, Margie. It's great to be home, and it's great to be with this audience. I miss everyone in Phillips Hall. I hope that once we return to some semblance of normality, we can all get back together again and do something like this in person. But for now, the virtual will have to do. So the title of my talk is From Pandemic to Promise, Rebuilding International Education in the Wake of COVID-19. And so what I intend to do this afternoon is to kind of go over our response here in IP to COVID, both from the standpoint of how it affected international students and then how it affected study abroad, and then kind of outline a path forward, because we will emerge from this. It will not last forever, fortunately. So in a lot of ways, COVID was our worst nightmare here in international programs, and you could argue that it was the same, really across campus, but it really hit us hard in really two ways. Again, from the standpoint of international students and how it affected them, and then from the standpoint of study abroad, because this is basically what we're set up to do in international programs. And now our core functions had become vulnerable, and even vulnerable is a polite word. I would even say that they had become threatened. And across the country when COVID hit, and I know it's been a while now, we're going back to January of this year, which seems basically a decade ago, rather than 10 months ago. But international programs offices really across the country in most institutions of higher learning were really the tip of the spear. They were the first units hit, and in many instances they will be the last to rebuild. So we are in sort of a constant state of trying to manage expectations but still plan so that we can move forward and emerge in a better position once things do get back to some semblance of what we consider to be normal. But our first order of business was to bring order to uncertainty and chaos, because no one had dealt with this before. No one knew what the virus was. It was really it was a very stressful situation, in part because we had a hard time figuring out what this was, and there wasn't a lot of guidance. So we had to, invent a lot of this as we went along. With respect to international students, this came at the COVID crisis came at an especially bad time, because our numbers of international students are already declining for a number of reasons. Some are political, some are related to the health crisis. There's also just more competition worldwide for international students. So this hit us at a particularly bad time. And the critical period, as we recall, is for international students was essentially January through March of 2020, because this is when the virus had emerged in East Asia, in China in particular, but then spread to Japan and South Korea. And so we were dealing primarily with students coming back from those countries, and we were trying to give them information with respect to, testing, quarantining, self-isolation as they returned to Iowa City. So our focus was really first on Wuhan, and Wuhan is actually very well represented in the Division of World Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. We have a number of instructors in our Chinese program and graduate students who both in Chinese and in the PhD in second language acquisition, who hail from Wuhan. We've got strong collaborations with Central China Normal University, with Huazhong Institute or Huazhong University of Science and Technology. I've been to both of these places in the past, and we have received delegations from both those institutions. And so this hit home for us in a very in a very direct way. We know lots of people in Wuhan. They know us. And so you can really humanize the experience. This is not just some sort of abstraction. And so the focus was on Wuhan, but we've got about 40 students all told at the University of Iowa from Hubei province, which is where the outbreak first occurred. So our focus was to try to track students. As we mentioned, we coordinated with student health. We tried to monitor symptoms. We mobilized communication through various platforms. We have people in our office who monitor WeChat constantly. WeChat is one of the primary social media platforms in China. There are other platforms that we use as well. So we were in constant communication with students and their families in China, trying to facilitate their return, helping them with travel arrangements, and then, self-isolation where needed. There are also many students who chose not to return to China during the winter break. As a result, they were here, and yet, they were afraid of getting exposed to COVID-19, even though it hadn't really broken out in Iowa or the United States at that time. However, they were in contact with their families. They realized how serious the situation was, and they wanted to know what precautions we were going to take to ensure that the outbreak really didn't spread here in Iowa. With all of that, we were also dealing with incidents of racism and xenophobia. Now, this is very unfortunate, obviously, but it is a reality. We saw, for example, numerous postings on social media that were of a racist and xenophobic nature. There were anecdotal reports as well. So at the beginning of the outbreak, we made it clear from the beginning that no derogatory comments based on perceived national origin or perceived ethnic origin would be tolerated, period. And we meaning international programs, set university policy in that regard. And we as an institution have adhered to that policy throughout. We think that this was obviously the right way to go for a number of reasons, but it was especially important to establish basically a no tolerance policy for any kind of racist or xenophobic commentary from the beginning. Okay. In talking about how international students experienced this, or at least when we heard about their experience, they were hit very hard by the pandemic, both financially and emotionally, because the economies in places like China, to a lesser extent South Korea, but Taiwan, the Indian subcontinent as well, started to plummet. Those economies got hit very hard by the pandemic. Students were short of money. Their families would write us and ask, can you give us a break on tuition? Can you waive fees? Can you give us extra scholarship money? Because, our income has gone down. So everything that happened in China and Korea foreshadowed the experience here in the United States. So we tried to help as best we could. We had folks contribute to the Student Emergency Fund, and at the same time, we confirmed our staunch advocacy for international students and our international community in general. We did not want them to be scapegoated in any way for what happened, because even after that first wave of the crisis in January and March, during the spring and the summer, the Department of Homeland Security, as well as the White House, issued all sorts of proclamations and executive orders that were unfavorable to international students. So there were restrictions on visas. There was increased monitoring of partnerships between academic institutions of higher learning in the United States and China in particular. There were more questions about intellectual property. Programs such as the optional practical training were limited or were more highly scrutinized. So it was just this kind of barrage of unfavorable executive orders, and in some cases legislation, that we had to, not only inform students of, but really, fight against as well. And so, as we said at the beginning, our international student numbers were already declining. But now that the US was seen as increasingly hostile to international students, we ran the risk of further declines or of students transferring. So we said from the beginning that we were here to support our international students and our international community, do whatever we could to help them. And that we would put them, or we obviously have to comply with the law, but that we were going to do everything we can to ensure their well-being. And so in terms of our response and the comeback, our support countered the narrative. Okay? We wanted to make sure that our international students heard differently from what they had heard in Washington. Because let's face it, perception is reality. Even if the administration didn't necessarily have a plan for implementing all of these measures, part of their strategy all along was psychological warfare. It was just to sow discord, throw everybody off their game, confuse them. We've seen this throughout history. What the White House did is nothing new. Nonetheless, when you have these destabilizing forces, when you're distorting reality, you can't control perception. And so when you've got vulnerable populations, such as international students, who are suffering economically, who don't necessarily understand what was going on. I mean, we as people who were brought up in the United States and speak English as our first language had trouble enough understanding what was going on. Imagine what it was like for someone who is newly arrived in the United States. So we had to build and maintain a sense of community. We did this during the spring and the summer. We had social events. We also had information sessions. We shored up our resource pages just to show that we had the backs of our international students. We advocated strongly. We continue to do that. We also urge international students to advocate for themselves. Part of our mission is always to educate. So we held info sessions about dealing with student legal services, dealing with unscrupulous landlords, how to understand visa restrictions, for example. We've got advisors in our office, who specialize in these things, how to even understand tax laws or how to work with banks. We've got folks who can help international students do that. So one of the things that I always say when I give talks like this is that if you have students who are in difficulty, send them to us, okay? We don't want them to feel any more isolated than they already are. We are here to help, so do not hesitate to give us notice when you think an international student is suffering in some form or another, or is in difficulty in some form or another. So that part of my background is in shared governance, obviously. So we try to engage more fully with shared governance organizations. So undergraduate student government, for example, GPSG, which is the graduate and professional student government. We have an international student advisory board and international programs with whom we meet regularly. This is to advocate for international students, but also to act as kind of a sounding board so that we can address their concerns in an orderly and an efficient manner. Similarly, not every student who went back home to China over the winter break last year returned to Iowa City. So we had to ensure online classes for those students who remained in their home country. We had to do this for students, for newly admitted students as well, who are now in China or India and other countries this fall, who are not able to make it to the United States either because of travel restrictions or because of visa problems. There's still a lot of embassies and consulates that are closed. And it's going to be the same for January. We had hoped originally that some of these students would be able to make it here for the spring term, especially now that we were starting a little bit later. And some will, but most will have to remain in their home countries. As a result, you know, we are ensuring that we can meet all of their instructional needs through online courses. And obviously, we need to be flexible with respect to their beginning of their plan of study. They can wait a year, they can wait a semester. We try to accommodate students as best we can. So that necessitated greater coordination between international programs and the Office of Admissions, the English as a Second Language program, academic advising, the Graduate College, TIPI. These are all units that work together in one form or another, but we actually made the coordination more systematic and more regular so that we could address these issues more effectively. And we've built kind of an infrastructure now which allows us to deal with these problems, I think, more and more effectively, and to anticipate some of these problems too, so that we're not just reacting, we're actually being proactive in terms of anticipating some of the academic and logistical issues that international students are facing these days. So even with all of that work, our incoming class of international students this year is lower than normal, but it's better than expected given the circumstances. And so, you know, in terms of morale, in terms of sort of championing the presence of international students on campus, we already in our communications and constituent relations office highlight the contributions of international students and scholars, but we're doing that on an increased level now so that we can give them more visibility and so that we can underscore as well the impact, the positive impact, obviously, that international students and scholars have on our community here at the university. So again, as part of the response and comeback, we're doing everything we can to reinforce and promote the idea that Iowa is a welcoming place, okay? And that education is a priority before politics. You know, and this is a phrase that I actually got from one of our partners in China. They were trying to help us out and maybe find, you know, a home for students who had enrolled in the University of Iowa, but who wanted to have a university experience in China before coming here, and to you know, give them an alternative to just taking courses online. And so this particular university partner in China said, well, you know, we realize that there's tension between the United States and China. We realize that the world situation is unstable right now, but education always comes before politics, and we are here to help. And so I think that that's a very healthy ethos as we negotiate some of these issues moving forward. Because our goal in the end is to create an intellectual community where learning from each other is the common bond. It's easy to lose sight of this, you know, because we lived in a hyper-politicized environment, or because we have a tendency to be territorial. But, you know, all of these reactions, while on some level maybe are understandable, prevent us from seeing what our original commitment is. And so we have to remind ourselves of the principles and the values that we hold as an academic institution, especially when it comes to global learning. And then moving forward, you know, we obviously have to recruit more international students to the University of Iowa. So we're exploring new parts of the world. To a certain extent, we've been over-leveraged in China. We'll continue to recruit in China, but we're looking at places such as the United Arab Emirates, certain countries in Africa, Latin America, and then we're also looking at Malaysia as a potential new market from which to recruit international students. So, the flip side of everything we do with respect to international students is study abroad. So we bring students here. We also send students to other countries. And so when COVID hit, in a very real sense, we had to undo everything we had built. Now, most study abroad units always plan for the worst. In some of the game planning scenarios that we have, we always say, well, what would happen if we had to bring everybody home all at once? We hope that never does happen, but it did last spring. And so we had to put that plan in place. We also had to invent it as we were doing it. In some cases, we were dealing with faculty-led programs. In other cases, pardon me, we were dealing with program providers. And in other cases, we were dealing with exchanges and or students who were simply abroad on their own. So each case, presented its own particular difficulties. Nonetheless, we brought everyone home safely over a 2 to 3 month period. And as was the case with international students, bringing back the students with respect to study abroad came in waves. At first, we were dealing with East and Southeast Asia, then Italy. After that, the rest of Western Europe, Oceania, so Australia and New Zealand, and then finally Latin America. So all told, about 250 students that we had to bring home. And, this was particularly sad. I mean, what we were dealing with on the international student side of things was sad. And we felt the same sort of despondency with respect to study abroad, because all of these programs of study, all of these goals, all of these dreams were interrupted. Let's not forget sort of the human toll here. Students had saved money, their families had borrowed, they'd reconfigured their academic programs to spend a semester abroad, and then everything just gets shut down and they have to come back. It was absolutely awful. And I will never stop feeling bad about this. Nonetheless, this is what we had to do given the nature of the pandemic. We know that the world is still shut down 7 months later, even though we all wish we were in a better place. The fact is that things have not gotten better. They've gotten worse in most instances. And so it was definitely the right thing to do, regardless of how regrettable the consequences are. We still have to, on a human level, remember that these students and their families cannot get this time back. And so there's a high degree of, remorse that we have to, that I think we all feel. Nonetheless, there is renewed interest in global experiences, especially through virtual programming. We offer several courses virtually that deal with international issues, and then we offer virtual global internships. This winter, for example, we are offering 4 courses that are part of our Winterim program. They're all well subscribed. They're in different fields. They're in medicine, they're in public health, they're in education, they're in business. So there's a market for this. And, when we held our virtual study abroad fair in September, over the course of 4 days, everything was done, electronically, obviously, but we had just as much, if not more, interest, this past semester or this past September, than we did, when we held a conventional study abroad fair, when we have the tables out in the old Capitol Mall. So students are hungering for this. At the same time, our Fulbright awards and applications are at their highest level. So I think people remain optimistic. I think they have an eye toward the future, and they know that they need to make plans for international experiences once things start opening up again. So return to normal. It won't be completely normal. It will be sort of normal. Get used to wearing masks. Get used to being screened at airports. Get used to washing your hands all the time. Get used to having to maybe carry around a vaccination card whenever you travel, or to show that or to prove that you are COVID negative. In some countries, for example, I mean, I've been to Russia a couple of times. if you want to go to Russia and get a visa, you have to get an HIV test, and you have to show, and obviously it has to be negative. Otherwise, you're not getting your visa. I can see in the future, I can envision, that people have to get COVID tests in order to obtain a visa, and that those tests are going to have to be negative. So that's part of the new normal, as it were. By most accounts, sorry, just 1 second, let me drink some water. By most accounts, we'll get a vaccine by the middle of next year. How effective it will be, we don't know. Some people are saying that the vaccine might have to be taken in 2 doses. Similarly, we don't know about distribution. Who's going to get it? How widespread is it going to be? And are people going, and is everyone going to take the vaccine? I mean, some people might refuse it. So that's something we just have to keep in mind. So any vaccine we get will not be a cure-all, but it will be an improvement. It'll be a vast improvement over where we are now. And so we have to, guard or keep some degree of optimism. So study abroad is on the horizon, possibly late summer, although it's not really looking that way. I think realistically speaking, we'll start sending folks abroad again by fall of 2021, so a year from now. So we have to be patient. Nonetheless, there's going to be a lot of pent-up demand. One of the questions we have to ask ourselves is whether or not we will have the capacity to meet that pent-up demand, no doubt. But with all of these challenges, there are opportunities, clearly. So there's a desire to collaborate and move toward the future. There's a strong desire for institutions and provider programs to work together to create new opportunities. And we see this, in many of the professional societies and many of the meetings that we attend, in the world of study abroad and in international student education as well. So there's opportunity for new curricular design around global themes and challenges. The current holding pattern that we're in has allowed for discussion and planning. I mean, one of the things that we had always talked about, before COVID hit was, or that we kind of lamented, well, we never have any time to talk about these things. We never have any time to plan. We never have any time to think about the future. Well, now we do, and I think a lot of us are taking advantage of that newfound time. Similarly, there's been, I think, a revived recognition of the importance of interdisciplinarity, teamwork, problem solving. I think that academe doesn't get enough credit for shifting to online platforms as quickly as it did. Let's remember that in March, we shifted our coursework online because I was teaching back then. I was doing a graduate seminar. We shifted online, and I know that Claire and Lauren and Nicole, you did, and Braden was part of this too. You made Herculean efforts to shift everybody online. I mean, I can't even imagine what it was like. And so, the infrastructure that you put in place is really a model for us moving forward. And yet, the story needs to be written about how quickly our profession shifted to this new mode of delivering instruction. I mean, I'll toot our horn a little bit and say that, private industry didn't necessarily adapt as quickly as we did, while parts of the economy were falling apart, we adjusted and adapted very quickly and thrived in this new environment, to the point where we are going to be integrating a lot of these new technologies moving forward. They're not just going to go away. So I want to take this opportunity to thank you for everything that you did to move us to this new reality, and to do so quite with such efficiency and with such professionalism and collegiality as well. So not to be forgotten. Nonetheless, there are some systemic challenges that we're all going to face. So how is the access gap going to be bridged? Not everybody has the same form of internet access. Not everyone has sort of the the constant access or the luxury of, always being available either on their phone or on their laptop or on their desktop. I mean, how do we be more inclusive? Are there, we know that there are certain classes and certain groups and certain sectors of our society that are more privileged than others. Are we doing the best we can to, reduce inequality in a system that is already, unequal and has become increasingly unequal? And so this happens on a domestic level. It also happens on a global level. And so it's not just bandwidth. I mean, obviously it's economic. It deals with health issues. Is that going to become greater once we emerge from COVID, or is it going to be reduced? Similarly, we have to reestablish the U.S. and its reputation as a country that is open to the international community. We'll see what happens in that regard. All we can do is control our own little corner of the world. And so I can assure you that from the standpoint of international programs, we are going to continue that pitch. It doesn't matter what happens, what goes on in Washington. Obviously, we have to comply with the law, but we will do whatever we can to make sure that we are an open and welcoming community to international students, their families, and to international scholars as well. So, where does higher education go from here? Or do we go it alone? Is the state going to be a partner with us? Are some corporations, or are we going to get some corporate support? Are we going to get some nonprofit support? Or are we just going to have to reinvent our own reality moving forward? All these are questions that have to be asked. Will there be coordinated national and international efforts to rebuild educational infrastructure? Those are questions that where we don't have answers right now, simply because we've got a lot of immediate crises that we have to deal with, such as the pandemic, which is only getting worse, race relations, but it's all part of the same systemic difficulty that we are dealing with. How do we resist nativism, sectarianism, insularity? All this has been, to a certain extent, maybe not exacerbated by the pandemic, but it's certainly been exposed and more exposed by the pandemic. And the answers, again, haven't been written, and they haven't been found. So what I try to tell people is to just be patient and to be disciplined. We've made it this far. We're in our 8th month of the pandemic, and we're probably going to have 8 more months of it. So we've adjusted well up to this point. I realize that there's fatigue. It's not just Zoom fatigue. It's confinement fatigue. It's social distancing fatigue. I mean, I get it. And some people are flat out rejecting it, not just in the United States, but elsewhere. You can be in denial all you want, but the fact is that the situation is only going to get worse if you refuse to recognize it. So we need to embrace these new forms of connection and creativity. We need to seek rest and inspiration when and where we can. We have to understand that looking ahead means looking inward as well as looking outward, because in the end, this world is ours, for better or worse. And so we will take our opportunities to remake it when and where we can. And with that, I will thank you and ask for questions.
Thank you, Russ. That was really, really fascinating. There's so many areas in what you do in international programs, in the going and receiving kind of, the 2 paths that you evoked. I will open it up in a second, but I have a couple of questions myself to start us off.
Sure.
What would you say, as you know, study abroad is integral to the language teaching and learning enterprise. It's the main mechanism by which we see growth in students' intercultural competence, their ability to develop the attitudes, skills, and behaviors that make them good global citizens. And with study abroad kind of not for the foreseeable, not an integral part of that pathway, of that learning pathway, do you anticipate that we'll see fewer majors? Do you have a message that you would send to students who are embarking on a study of language? And I think partially it is to be patient and that they'll be able to go at some point. But you know, what kind of words of wisdom might you give to a language student, a student of language, rather?
Well, a couple things. One is that to answer your question, will we see a decline of majors? The answer to that question is yes. We've already seen it up, even before COVID, and I think that'll continue to occur. Nonetheless, I don't think that's the end of the world. In many of the departments in DWILC, while we saw a decrease in the number of majors, we also saw, and French is a really good example, a big increase in the number of minors. Students like credentials.
Yes.
They because they look good on their CVs, and it's the same with experiential learning, and often language study, especially study abroad or a virtual global internship, is a high impact practice that potential employers, or if one is applying to graduate school, will single out. I can't tell you how many times students have told me that, well, one of the reasons why studying abroad or having an internship was valuable is because when I went for my first job interview, the potential employer saw this on my CV and wanted to ask me about it. Okay? So tell me about that summer in Spain. Tell me about that semester or that Fulbright experience in Taiwan. Because this distinguishes our students or students who have these experiences from the competition. You have to do everything you can to make yourself marketable. And even though I think the world has become more insular at the moment, it's not going to stay that way. It is going to open up. It's probably up again, and it's probably going to open up with a vengeance. And so I would advise all students to be prepared for this. We're going to be global whether we like it or not. The pandemic proved that.
Yeah.
The pandemic proved that we are all interconnected. This affected everyone. Okay, no one was left untouched by the pandemic. And the simple fact is that if you look at the problems that we have, as a global society, climate change, health concerns, such as pandemics, terrorism, security, cybersecurity, things like that. All of these problems have to be solved, global inequality. All of these problems need to be solved, by working across ethnicities, across nations. We have to take an international approach to these problems. I mean, one of the reasons why the pandemic is as bad as it is because there's no global strategy.
Pure cooperation, yeah.
Yeah, no cooperation.
Right.
The World Health Organization was basically neutered,
Right.
by various parties. But the fact that, the US, Europe, East Asian countries, African countries, Latin American countries couldn't come together and figure out a strategy to contain the pandemic, that we were all sort of on our own. You work on a vaccine here, I'll work on a vaccine there, and maybe we can collaborate in some way. That has no doubt exacerbated the situation, and so many people have suffered and died, and so many people have lost their jobs because we weren't able to get it together on an international level.
I was, while you were talking, I was sort of reminded of the post-World War II period in which we saw a huge growth in language study, that was backed by the government and the Fulbright program, and it was really basically the era in which study abroad was inaugurated, and exchanges. And area studies and all kinds of things that kind of grew out of in the 50s and 60s, right? And then it was still a wave that you and I were riding in the 80s.
Right. Oh, for sure.
Right?
For sure.
Absolutely. Are you optimistic? I guess it sounds like you just said, you know, right? Optimistic that this wave, we might get some kind of wave taking us in that
Right.
direction.
Right. No, I'm optimistic because I think that, you know, especially students are curious about the world. Iowa students are curious about the world. You know, I saw this personally when I was in the Division of World Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. I saw this at the University of Nebraska when I was there. Because I think students understand that they have an opportunity to contribute. They don't want to just you know, remain sort of cut off from society, because they understand that that puts them at a distinct disadvantage. If they really want to make it in the world, they're going to have these high impact experiences and engage with it in a way that challenges them. Otherwise, you know, things become, I think, a little bit too secure and a little bit too what's the proper word? Sort of, people become too self-involved, and that's not healthy when we are facing problems of such a universal nature.
I had another question. Does anybody have any other questions before I jump in with one more? Making this back and forth. You talked about the changing recruitment areas for international students, and that's really fascinating. I have a very dear friend, Grinnell, who does international student recruitment, and he's been, you know, going to some of the places you mentioned. Certainly Africa is a new part. Certain parts of Africa have come up as recruitment areas. And I hadn't heard of Malaysia before, but Vietnam also is one. So I'm just kind of intrigued about, I sort of a twofold question, or maybe a follow-up after, but how would like the shifting recruitment kind of change anything, if at all, in the way the university works with these students? We've become very familiar with certain populations, you know, in the ESL program, for example, or, you know, how are things going to be evolving?
Well, I mean, we're doing a couple of things. One is that we're taking a more coordinated strategy with respect to working with the Office of Academic Advising, ESL programs, Tippy College of Business. I mean, the IP is now, you know, we have now hired an international student recruitment advisor who was formerly in the, well, still is in the Institute for International Business, to give us advice, because this person has connections in these places, because you've got to develop these personal relationships. Part of the ethos behind all of this is to internationalize the campus and to make the campus look more like the world. We've been, you know, as we've said, we've been over leveraged in China. And so, the reality is that there will never be another China. That bubble, it hasn't burst, but it has shrunk. And in part because the Chinese have built universities hand over fist. It's the same in India, and even though, and their population is getting a bit older, it's not as young as it was, but there are other countries like Malaysia, like Indonesia, and Vietnam that have very, very young populations. And so with Vietnam, I mean, one of the things that we've talked about, and we've explored at least a little bit, is to work with Kirkwood Community College to recruit students for their associate's degree programs. And they would then matriculate to the University of Iowa to finish their majors, say in public health, business, engineering, class, whatever it may be. But part of what we want to do is sort of reshape the international population on campus to make it more representative of the world community in general. So that's definitely a goal of ours.
And one final question is how, in your your goal to do increased visibility strategies with your international students, I'm thinking about ways in which the now CLCL could support that. We're working on International Education Week with some of your colleagues, but I'd love to think about ways that we can collaborate and do this as well. Nikki is running our peer tutoring program that has, I'd say, a good 2/3 of the students are international, the tutors who are running this, and she's made some really great videos about how, peer education services can really enhance student success. And I think it's a great way to profile those international students who are working in that capacity, because they're part of the internationalization mission as well, in a way.
Exactly. Well, a couple of ideas come to mind. One is, Nikki, we'd be happy to share those videos and post them on our platforms. We have a big social media operation, as you know, in international programs. So this could be part of our, this could be one way in which we could work together to educate the UI community in general about the contributions of international students, but also educate international students about some of the resources that are available. Similarly, I think it'd be great if we could do sort of a webinar or sort of a platform where we just listen to international students, listening to international student voices about their experiences. We've done that a little bit in IP, but my sense is that we could work with DWILC on this as well. I mean, I'd like to hear their stories about the pandemic. I'd like to hear their stories about how they've adapted to virtual learning. What skills have they had to sharpen to adapt into this new reality? How do they juggle between being in different worlds? I think that sharing those experiences would be a wonderful way in which we could work together. I mean, we're always putting together panels in IP. We're always moderating things. I mean, Luis Martinez Tudillo, for example, has a lecture that we're sponsoring next week. And it's more sort of for faculty, but these are ways that we can continue to partner with one another, because in this day and age, it's all about promotion. It's all about publicity and sort of getting your voice and your programming out there. Because we've got to stay on people's radar screens. It's easy to forget because we can't meet in person. We can't have the social interaction that we once had. But now, there are other opportunities available to us through other platforms, and we should take advantage of those.
Yeah, we're all about making short videos, and I talked with a couple of your colleagues about doing some digital storytelling. I think we were mostly focusing on study abroad, which is kind of what I'm doing right now with some of the departments.
Oh, sure.
And well, sure. But I think digital storytelling with international student voices would be great.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. I mean, again, we do that a little bit in our shop, but we can always expand more, and it'd be great to partner with you on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think Rosie had to take off. Our internet is unstable.
Okay.
And Margie, did you have any final questions or words, or Lauren or Nikki? Anyone? So hard in Zoom to try to make eye contact with somebody and force them to ask a question. I want to thank you so much, Russ, for this really wonderful talk. It really was elucidating, and such a great pleasure to hear from you and think about how optimistic you are and your vision for the future. And it was really wonderful. And I'm sure we'll be sharing the recording around the DWILC very shortly, and I think people would really like to see it.
If you have it available, let me know, and then we'll probably post it on some of our platforms as well.
Perfect. Okay. That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
All right.
All right.